My name is Isabel Araiza, and I am a co-founder of For the Greater Good. We're a grassroots organization that really started in 2016 after the third water bowl in 10 months. Basically, after we formed as a group, we really committed to trying to learn and understand what was going on with our water infrastructure, because it was just kind of like this cascading failure, water failure after water failure after water failure. And so when we went to the downtown public library, which is wonderful, there's a public archives on the second floor. In that process, we learned a lot. A lot of the major infrastructure that was laid out for the city was laid out in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And that water infrastructure really only had a lifespan of about 25 to 50 years. So by the 1970s, they should have already started, replacing the water lines, and they just weren't doing that. There were recounts of, as the city was spreading and there'd be rainfall, you'd have flooding, and then there would be basically like backups in the water, and then sewage would kind of erupt out of people's toilets and contaminate their homes and their property. And that was documented as far back as the 1970s. They were raising awareness that there needed to be something done to improve our water and our wastewater infrastructure. The earliest water lines actually went in the areas that were the old school or were the white-only areas in Corpus, right? And so eventually, when the industrial build-out happened, the white-only areas were rezoned for areas that Black people could live in. That area wound up being neglected. In the 1980s, we went through this period where the city was trying to basically trim the fat off of city budgets, and so they were disinvesting in maintaining our public infrastructure. And so the other thing that winds up happening is that the oldest areas of town, which are now the brown and Black areas of town, wind up being neglected, and they weren't building the adequate infrastructure, like the elevated towers, so that you could have the right volume, like going through the pipes, and so they weren't doing that. They weren't maintaining the water towers that they had, and that was just adding more stress to our water infrastructure because our city kept spreading at the same time that the city was not putting money back into the maintenance of those areas. In 2012, the EPA sues the city for not maintaining their wastewater infrastructure. People in positions of power, I'm not really sure if they were public officials or just influential officials, were then trying to cast blame in terms of the waste that they were finding in the bay. They were saying, well, it's people who are walking their dogs and they're not picking up after themselves, and so that stuff's getting flushed out into the bay. Trying to avoid responsibility and scapegoat things and people that really didn't have the resources to defend themselves. So rather than say, oh, my bad, look, our wastewater infrastructure is failing, we need to invest resources. They had to be sued, and then there was this kind of ongoing discussion between the EPA and the city of Corpus Christi to come to some sort of resolution about how much money would actually be invested in improving their wastewater infrastructure. Well, when you look at the EPA suing the city, it's evidence that the city is resisting its responsibility to provide adequate and safe infrastructure, not just for the community, but for the bays. And so trying to get around basically taking responsibility for the fact that our wastewater infrastructure wasn't being maintained. It was actually impacting our bays, which was in essence like a violation of the Clean Water Act. Between 2015 and 2016, we had 3 water boils in the span of 10 months. Each of the water boils were in like different durations. And, sometimes it takes a little while for people to actually recognize that the things that we're experiencing are not just accidents or like one-offs, that there's some sort of systemic failure that's happening. Well, because we had those 3 water boils in 10 months, it really kind of elevated people's awareness. And the 3rd water boil was particularly problematic because there was a sense that the city knew that there was a problem with the water, but actually delayed notifying the public about the water boil or the issues with the water out of concern for basically like the restaurant industry. And so people were super mad about this, right? Because it's the 3rd water boil in 10 months. We have to either boil our water or run out and buy water. And I remember after that incident, there was an emergency meeting at the city council. My kids were in school, so I went ahead and decided to go to that meeting. And I remember walking into the city council chambers, and it was jam-packed, which is something you just don't see. And in that space, there were people who were complaining about how that water boil was impacting them and the inconveniences that they were experiencing. But then there were also people who were actually talking about their concerns for the broader community. And so there were some people talking about the elderly, there were some people that were talking about the disabled, people on dialysis, the homeless, the poor. And so you could see that there were people who weren't just thinking about themselves, but they were thinking about the collective. And the cool thing is that we started kind of reaching out and walking around city council and getting each other's numbers so that we could meet together. And ultimately, that's what we wound up doing. Right after that, we formed a group text and made plans to actually meet. And an organizer from the nurses union basically made their space available to us so that we could have our first meeting. And from then on, we just made a commitment to meet. I believe it was weekly at the very beginning to talk about what we thought the issues were. And that's actually, during that process, we made the decision that we would do all that we could to learn about our water. So we committed to sending one of us, the core group, to any meeting that was connected to any type of water that was associated with the city, wastewater, or regular drinking water. And so that's what we started doing. There was this meeting that was announced that was called H2O for Texas. And it was at the Salomon Ortiz building. And so a couple of us went down to that meeting to, again, H2O water, to see what was going on. And we were struck. The Texas Water Development Board was there, but also there were elected officials that were there, and then there were regular people who were clearly really concerned, and not just regular people from Corpus, but there were also people from like Mathis, for example. And I remember being at that meeting, getting this little handout, and we were sitting right next to a city council member, Lillian Rojas, who was also like the comms person or somebody high up for Valero. And the meeting starts and the politicians leave the room, and the water board is doing a presentation talking about there's going to be this increased demand for water. And they were pushing Desal, and they had slides behind them. And the slides actually showed that the population growth was really flat. And so for them to say that there was going to be this increased demand for water on the horizon, even though their projections that were going out 50 years showed a flat population growth, like the words coming out of their mouth and the data that they were showing us just didn't align. And then there were, people from Mathis that were concerned about the water that was being released into the bay, and voicing their concerns. And those same politicians who were just there, like local politicians, but also state politicians, who could have been hearing the concerns, were not in the room listening to the presentation or to the public's concerns. And I remember kind of looking around going, what's going on? And so this was like an early flag for us. One about desal, but also two, we were looking into like, well, who is this H2O for Texas? And you know, why weren't the public officials there? And it turned out that the people that were actually sponsoring H2O for Texas were all like the fossil fuel industry and major manufacturers, like chemical corporations, like those kind of people. They were the ones that were actually pushing desal. They were the ones that were trying to like fluff up this, like raise the flags around the water crisis, which I think on some level is still really important, but it didn't push us in the direction of asking, you know, are we using our water responsibly? Who's using our water? Should they be using their water? How should our water be used? Actually, it was just like, let's get more water. And how can we get that? And what winds up happening, I remember it was December, finals were over, but the kids were still in school. And I remember waking up in the morning thinking that I was gonna get to work because the kids were in school, but finding out that schools were closed because we had a full water ban. And again, the announcement came out late the night before, and it said that we weren't, not just like we weren't able to drink our water, we weren't able to use our water. And that was huge, right? So by that time, we had already been meeting for almost 6 months. When I look at my phone, there's these messages from the people who have been meeting regularly saying, look, we've got to get together and organize and get water out, distribute it to the community. So again, there was another huge failure on the part of the city, but this time we actually had a support group that could work together to ensure that people had water. We actually met for they were gonna have a press conference. And so, you know, they're like, we need to go to the press conference. And so we all headed out over there. We had also, when we first formed, we wound up creating a Facebook group for the greater good. We would post information, anything that we learned about at any meeting. And so we were able to announce that we were going to be down there. And basically, right, it's a group of us coming together that trust one another. And so when they were having their press conference, it was also kind of like around a year after the Flint water crisis that happened in Michigan. And so now there was a broader narrative in the United States around, right, cities and states failing to meet the needs of the people. And so I think there was kind of like this intersection that happened where we go to the press conference and the city's trying to manage the discussion. They're not taking questions out in the open. And so we interrupted the meeting. And I don't think that that would have happened if we were just all there as individuals as opposed to being there in groups, because we knew we had each other's back. And then we were able to have like a little rally at the front of City Council. And basically after 6 months of trying to push the city to make responsible choices, we were able to be organized at that time in such a way that now our words really held weight because we'd been committed to this action for some time. And people were actually donating money, and so we were able to buy water. We had been thinking about, people's needs, and so the water ban happened, and we were able to get water distributed. And then other people came. I mean, from Victoria, from San Antonio, the Valley, San Marcos, bringing water to us. And so we had to store the water, and then we were able to distribute it. We set up shop like right by the bus station so that people didn't need to have cars. We were able to distribute water before the city was, and then the city also, when they did their water distribution, they only had 4 sites throughout the entire city, and then they required that people drive over there, and they were only given 2 cases per household. So, they were basically making huge assumptions about what people were able to actually get access to water that they were providing. And it was really, for us, I think it was an important moment too, because we were prepared and able to actually get water out to people. So we were organized, we were mobilized, and then we were not just, talking the talk, we were walking the walk. So it was kind of cool. But again, even that water ban in 2016, it gave us some legitimacy as a group. We were even invited to an emergency management meetings, which was the first time that city or regular people were actually invited to be part of those planning meetings, When we were at those meetings, what we noticed is that they were just basically doing emergency management for hurricanes, not for basically water crises that, like the failure of the water infrastructure or water crises that were caused by what industry was doing. So, there was, what we learned as a group. There was a budget crisis in 2018. The budget crisis, we didn't have enough money. They were talking about cutting budgets to the libraries and to closing a senior center. And here we were in Corpus with some of the richest corporations, not just in the country, but in the world, right? And we were talking about not being able to fund our libraries or keep a senior center open in a historically working class Mexican neighborhood, right? People who suffered from not having opportunities during Juan Crow, not just Jim Crow, having their public space being potentially closed. And so that helped us become aware of the fact that corporations weren't paying their fair shares. The refineries weren't paying their shares. They had industrial district agreements. They caused the water ban. We made the argument that they were causing our budget crises. And we were able to stop those budget cuts. And I also think that actually was directly connected to us being invited to be part of the Coastal Alliance to protect our environment. When we did that, then we learned that the problems that we were facing in Corpus were much bigger than what was going on along Refinery Row and what was happening in Corpus, that basically we were becoming refinery region. And there was this explosive growth in the sandpack counties, right? And they were polluting our environment. We were seeing the permits that were being proposed and not challenged. And it really raised our awareness that we needed to do something. And so this is where the idea of a Desal Charter Amendment emerged, because what we also learned in that summer of 2016 is that Corpus was responsible not just for our water, but for the region's water. And so we saw that Corpus and Corpus Christi residents could actually shape the policy that impacted the broader community. And so we committed to a Desal Charter Amendment to try to get the city to not be able to pursue desalination. Because, they were pushing that despite the public's opposition. We were a small public, but whenever we raised awareness about what was going on with desalination, we could get people to come into city meetings and talk about those concerns. After the H2O for Texas thing, we actually worked on learning more about desalination and those policies, and we wound up putting a pamphlet together. One of our ideas was to create an info pamphlet about desalination because the city was pushing it during Black Friday. We wanted to raise awareness about it. We made a trifold, and we set up basically at the intersection where the big retail outlets are in Corpus, and try to pass out basically material. And people were so unfamiliar with desalination that whenever we were talking about desal, they thought we were talking about diesel gas. So there was no awareness about what was going on, right? And then we were we really need to push. We need to raise awareness, but we also need to stop the industrial build out. And the way to stop the industrial build out was by putting a chokehold on industry being able to get unfettered access to water, because they were pushing desalination because they thought they'll just keep sucking water out of the bay. And so we worked with Texas Campaign for the Environment, an attorney that they connected us to come up with language so that we could draft a Desal Charter Amendment that basically could stand a challenge in court, because we knew that's what was going to happen. It took us a while to be able to get buy-in from the broader community around stopping, and I think it's because industries work really hard to try to convince the people that we need them, when in reality they need us. They need our natural resources in order to operate. Ultimately, we were able to get the charter amendment language down, and we started the petition. When we started the petition, we basically started during an early voting period during primary season in March. We were able to collect hundreds of signatures in a really short period of time. And we were like, yes, we've got this, because all we really wanted was for the public to vote on whether or not the city pursues desalination. Desal is so expensive in terms of tax dollars, but also in terms of like resources. And if you think about climate change and the amount of energy it takes to actually run a desal plant. And so we should have a say-so on that, right? People who were clearly bought by industry shouldn't be able to drive policy, especially when they were just dismissing us as you could see that our voices were growing. So we launched the charter amendment. We're able to collect signatures, but then COVID happens and everything gets shut down. All public meetings, everything. And we're still trying to collect signatures and stay safe, and that's happening. TCE comes in and supports us by offering us basically like postage. And we're able to send petitions out for people to sign them, collect signatures from their little pot of people, and then return them back to us. During this period of time, even city council meetings are no longer public. They're just call-in, and the mayor basically can run city council meetings the way they want, and the mayor tries to shut down discussion around public comment. He limits public comment to 1 minute or 1,000 characters. Not 1,000 words, 1,000 characters. And so really stifling the public. And so even in the face of all of that, no public events, the city shut down, schools shut down, we're still able to collect more than 4,000 signatures, more than 4,200 signatures from registered voters. We needed 9,000. We didn't get that, but I think one of the things that happened is we raised awareness around desalination, who was for, how much it was going to cost, and the fact that the city was moving forward despite not listening to the public. Things have gotten more complicated now because despite our growing opposition, they continue to go down that track. Initially, when they were making the votes to get more money and to spend more money towards desal, they'd say, well, this isn't us saying yes, it's just in case, and not accepting responsibility, but still voting affirmatively. And so now we're in this position where permits are either approved or they're being considered. But our resistance is still persisting and our movement's growing. I mean, the TCEQ meeting in April was huge. We had hundreds of people. They try to use that space, I think, to make us look small. And what they did is, the acoustics there were fantastic. So it just amplified our voices. And it gave us an opportunity to actually show the public and everybody how the people power that does exist, the resistance, and really like courage is contagious. It's like lighting a flame. And we came together and it was just beautiful. And I think it's growing.